Cloud Identities with PowerShell. Hey everyone, Ben Finkel here, and in this nugget, I want to talk explicitly about the various PowerShell commandlets that you need to be able to work with and how you can work with them, both for your job as a day-to-day administrator of Office 365, as well as in order to pass the 70-346 exam. I've got up on screen here a list of the 20 or 21 PowerShell commandlets that you might use when working with identities inside of Office 365, and yeah, there's a lot of them. You're probably thinking, oh man, that is a ton of PowerShell commandlets. You're not wrong, and you know what? We don't have the time or space to go through each and every one of these inside of this nugget. That's okay. What I've got here at the bottom are two links to the reference documentation for these commandlets, and I encourage you to load those up, bookmark them, keep them handy because they're a great place to reference exactly how to use these commands. Now, here inside of this nugget, I'm just going to pick and choose a few of them to sort of go through in a little bit more depth and talk about some of the more interesting properties that either you may run into on a day-to-day basis when you're using PowerShell with Office 365, or this is important, that you might run into on the exam. So we're going to take a little bit of a look at get user, new user, restore user, which we already talked about in another nugget, as well as set user, which is how you update a password. Real importantly, we're going to talk about how you set the MSOL user password commandlet. Over here on the group commands, how do we add a group member? How do we remove a group member? These are important because a lot of times they use object ID versus user principal name. So I want to kind of show you how these commands work in general. Once you see how really 2 or 3 of them work, you'll get a feel. You'll understand how the rest of them work as well, and I think it'll make it a lot easier to work with them. So I'm just going to drop right into my PowerShell window here, and inside of this context, I've already connected to the MSOL service. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go check out the nugget on connecting PowerShell to Office 365 inside of this series. And the first commandlet that I want to talk about is just get-msol user, which you can run without passing any other parameters into it, and that's just going to return a list of all of the users that are inside of the system. Rather, I should say, it's going to return a list of all of the active users that are inside of the system. There's very few interesting properties to do with get-msol user. One thing that you could do is you can pipe it into the format table commandlet, select property, and get some other interesting properties. So you might want user principal name, display name, and object ID. That's a really important property we'll talk about in a second. So that's going to show me all those users with the extra property instead of the is licensed, which I don't find particularly interesting. Object ID, that's really interesting, so I want to bring that up a lot. But some other important properties that you can pass in to get MSOL user are, well, return deleted users. We talked about that in an earlier nugget. What that will do is that will show you any users that have been soft deleted, which is arguably any user that's been deleted from the system. When you pass that in, instead of active users, you get users that are in effectively the recycling bin. They're waiting to be deleted, where they'll sit and wait, and you can always restore them with the restore-msol user command, which again we covered in a nugget on users and groups. A couple of other properties that you might find interesting on get-msol user. Well, there's dash object ID or dash user principal name, which of course you can pass in to select just a single user that you identify by that user principal name or object ID. And this one I think is also really important as well. Unlicensed users only. When you call the unlicensed users only parameter, that only shows users that don't have a license. So there's one user I have that doesn't have a license associated with them, so they returned with the unlicensed users only. And using those parameters, you can then pass these into an object inside of PowerShell or even pipe them into another command if you want. Now the opposite of get-msol user, of course, is set-msol user. And set-msol user has a bunch of different properties that you can update on the user itself. When you want to update a user, you need to pass in either the user principal name or the object ID. It's important to remember all the users have both of those things, a user principal name and an object ID. And that's important because, well, you'll see it with the group membership PowerShell commandlets. They don't take user principal name, they take object IDs only. So you need to be able to look up those object IDs, learn how to use them, and work with them when you're working with PowerShell. But most importantly, you've got down here, password never expires. If you want to set the password to never expire on a user, then you need to set this to be true. Having done that, oops, and I need to pass in a user principal name. We'll set it on joeuser@cbtnrocks.com. The password never expires, just like it sounds like. That sets his password to never expiring. There's another really interesting parameter that you can use here, and that is going to be, I'm just going to bring it up here, strong password required. Earlier in our nugget on passwords, I explained that you can't disable password complexity requirements on the system, but I was kind of lying because on a user-by-user basis inside of PowerShell, you can disable password complexity by setting strong password required equal to false. When you do that, now that user no longer requires a strong password. Of course, it's important to know how you can combine these two as well. So you get -msol user and then pipe it into the set -msol user commandlet. We could do exactly that and say, let's make it true because that's a better option. What this is going to do is this is going to pipe in every result from get MSOL user into set MSOL user and update their strong password required to true, yeah, for every user in the system. So combining these, that's going to come up on the exam, I assure you, piping the results of one of these commandlets into another. One of those really important commandlets is set MSOL user password. With this, you can set the user password to something, whatever you like. You simply pass in the new password requirement. Let's make it XYZ 1 2 3 4 5 6 exclamation point. I got to make sure that it is meets the complexity requirements. And I can also pass in the force change password and set it equal to true. And this will, just like the name implies, set the new password, but also force the user to change it the next time that they sign in. There's another combination of parameters you can use here. Instead of passing the new password, we can say force change password, set that equal to true, and force change password only, and also set that to true. And what that's going to do is that won't change the user's password. That's only going to say, hey, next time they sign in, they have to change it. They're going to be prompted and forced to change it on their own from whatever their existing current password is. Every command that's available on the set-msol user is also available for new-msol user, which, yeah, like it sounds, creates a new user inside of the system. So I could create a new user with the user principal name of joeuser2 at cbtnrocks.com. Oops, I forgot display name is also required. So display name joeuser2. Better put that in quotes since it's got spaces in it. And that will create a new user. Now joeuser2 is a user inside of my system. And notice that it gave me the temporary password that it created for that user as well. So that as the administrator, I can communicate that out to them however I need to, or call the set MSOL user password and update it to some random password maybe of my choosing. Whatever the case is, that's how that works. I'd also like to touch briefly on the group and role membership commandlets. We covered these fairly in depth in other nuggets, so I don't think we need to go over them too much here. But just to cover the basics, what you're going to need to know: get-msol group, just like get-msol user, is going to return a list of all the groups in the system. Here I can see that I've got 3 groups. 2 of them are distribution lists, and 1 of them is a security group. Now, the object ID that comes up there on the left is very important. That's the only way to uniquely identify a group inside of the system. The display name is not a unique identifier. Nothing else is a unique identifier but that object ID. And that's important because that's how you work with membership for groups. For instance, let's add a group member with the add-msol group member commandlet. When I look at the parameters that come up, there is no way to identify the group other than with the group object ID parameter. So I have to uniquely identify groups with this parameter here. I'm going to copy that to the clipboard, paste it right here. The member, I also need to use the object ID. And the reason for that is because, yeah, you can make users members of a group, but you can also make groups members of a group. So when you're indicating what member you want to add to the group, you have to do it by object ID with the group member object ID commandlet. So here I've just grabbed the GUID for joeuser at cbtnrocks.com. This is going to add that user to this group. I'll execute that command. Now they're added to the group. I can look at that, of course, with the get-msol group member command. I just need to pass in a group object ID again. That's right, because again, what group do we want to list? Well, we have to identify it by its object ID. And there we can see that joeuser at cbtnrocks is the user that is a member of that particular group. Remove MSOL group member works exactly the same. We have to pass in the group object ID and the group member object ID in order to remove a member. We can create new groups with the very simple new-msol group commandlet that will create a new security type group. All I have to pass in is a display name, so I could call it group 2. There. Now I've created a new group. It gives me the object ID as the result, and if I call get-msol group, I can see that it's listed in my active groups. So that concludes this nugget on cloud identities with PowerShell. Just to recap, there's a lot of different commandlets that you can use to work with cloud identities and group membership inside of PowerShell for Office 365, but they all function more or less the same, and they're all very self-explanatory. I hope you got an understanding of how to use them, how to use the user principal name and the object ID inside of those commandlets. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.